The clock on the wall read 6:47 in the morning, and Margaret Chen was already awake. She had been awake for hours, actually. Sleep hadn't come easy the night before. How could it? Today was the day she'd been dreading for months. She sat at her small kitchen table, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold. The surgery paperwork lay spread out in front of her, each page a reminder of what was coming. Gallbladder removal. The doctor had said it was routine, that thousands of people had this procedure every year. But for Margaret, nothing about this felt routine. She was 67 years old and completely alone. Her husband Robert had died 5 years ago. A heart attack, sudden and cruel. They'd been married for 42 years and never had children. It wasn't by choice, really. Life just happened that way. They'd tried in their younger years, then eventually made peace with it being just the two of them. And for a long time that had been enough. But now Robert was gone and the apartment felt too quiet. Her friends from the library where she'd worked for 30 years had mostly moved away, or were dealing with their own health problems. Her younger brother lived in Seattle and they barely spoke twice a year. There was Mrs. Patterson from upstairs, but she was 83 and could barely manage her own grocery shopping. Margaret picked up the papers again, reading the same lines she'd read 100 times. Patients must have a responsible adult drive them home and stay with them for at least 24 hours following surgery. She'd called the hospital about this 3 times. Each time the person on the phone had given her the same answer. No exceptions. It was policy. Someone had to be there. "What if I take a taxi?" she'd asked during the last call. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We need someone who can stay with you. The anesthesia can cause confusion, nausea, dizziness. You might fall. You'll need help with medications." Margaret had hung up feeling defeated. She'd almost canceled the surgery right then. But the pain had been getting worse. Sharp, stabbing sensations that took her breath away. The doctor had been clear. This wasn't going to get better on its own. So here she was, getting ready to go to the hospital, still with no one to list as her emergency contact. She dressed slowly, choosing comfortable clothes like the hospital had instructed. Loose pants, a button-up shirt. No jewelry except her wedding ring. She couldn't bring herself to take that off, even though the instructions said to remove all rings. The cab arrived at 7:30. The driver was a young man who barely looked at her as she climbed into the back seat. He had headphones in one ear and didn't seem interested in conversation. Margaret was grateful for that. She didn't feel much like talking anyway. St. Mary's Hospital was a 20-minute drive across town. Margaret watched the city pass by her window. People were heading to work, walking dogs, living their normal lives. She wondered if any of them had ever felt this alone. The hospital entrance loomed ahead, all glass and steel. Modern and efficient. Margaret paid the driver and walked through the automatic doors, clutching her purse against her chest like a shield. The registration desk was busy. 3 people stood in line ahead of her. Margaret waited, her stomach churning with anxiety that had nothing to do with the surgery itself. It was what came after that terrified her. "Next, please," Margaret stepped forward. The woman behind the desk had kind eyes and wore scrubs with tiny flowers on them. "Name, please?" "Margaret Chen. I'm here for surgery at 9 o'clock. The woman typed on her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Yes, here you are. I'll need to see your ID and insurance card." Margaret fumbled in her purse, hands shaking slightly. She handed over the cards. "Thank you. Now I need to confirm your emergency contact information." The woman looked at her screen, then frowned slightly. "It shows here that you haven't listed anyone. Is that correct?" This was the moment Margaret had been dreading. "Yes, that's correct." The woman's expression shifted to concern. "Mrs. Chen, you'll need someone to drive you home after the procedure and stay with you. It's hospital policy." "I know. I've called about this. I live alone. I don't have anyone." The words hung in the air, heavy and true. Saying them out loud somehow made them feel even more real. The woman bit her lip. "Let me get my supervisor. Just one moment." She disappeared through a door behind the desk, leaving Margaret standing there feeling exposed. The people in line behind her shifted impatiently. Margaret wanted to disappear. A few minutes later, the woman returned with an older man in a white coat. He introduced himself as Mr. Phillips, the surgical coordinator. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're in a difficult situation," he said gently. "But we really can't release you without someone to care for you. The anesthesia stays in your system. You could fall. Forget to take your medications, have complications. Is there anyone at all? A neighbor? A friend from church? Margaret shook her head. There's no one. But I need this surgery. The pain is getting unbearable. Mr. Phillips sighed. I understand. Let me talk to the surgical team. We may have to postpone until we can arrange for home health care or find another solution. Postpone? But I've been waiting for this appointment for 2 months. The pain, I know, and I'm sorry. Please have a seat in the waiting area. Let me see what we can do. Margaret walked to the waiting room on legs that felt like they might give out. She found a chair in the corner, away from the other people scattered around the room. A man was reading a magazine. A woman was knitting. An elderly couple sat holding hands. Everyone seemed to have someone except her. She put her face in her hands, trying not to cry. This was ridiculous. She was a grown woman. She'd survived her husband's death. She'd lived alone for 5 years. Surely she could manage one night after surgery. But the hospital didn't see it that way, and deep down Margaret knew they were right to worry. The last time she'd had even mild food poisoning, she'd been so dizzy she'd knocked over a lamp trying to get to the bathroom. What if something like that happened after surgery? Time crawled by. Margaret watched other patients get called back for their procedures. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 8:15, 8:30. Her surgery was supposed to start at 9. She saw Mr. Phillips walk past the waiting room twice, talking on his phone both times. He looked stressed. At 8:45, a nurse called her name. Margaret stood up quickly, hope fluttering in her chest. But the nurse just led her to a small consultation room. The coordinator will be with you shortly, she said, then left. Margaret sat in the stiff plastic chair, staring at a poster about hand washing. Her throat felt tight. Were they going to cancel? Send her home with her gallbladder still inside, still causing pain. The door opened and Mr. Phillips entered, followed by the woman from the registration desk. Mrs. Chen, he began, and his tone told her everything she needed to know. She closed her eyes and waited for the words that would mean she'd have to go home alone. Surgery postponed, pain continuing with no solution in sight. This was what it meant to be truly alone in the world, and it had never felt more frightening than it did right now. Just as Mr. Phillips opened his mouth to speak, there was a knock on the door. A tall man with dark hair poked his head in. Sorry to interrupt, he said, but I think I might be able to help with this situation. Mr. Phillips looked confused. I'm sorry, this is a private consultation. Are you family? No, but I was in the waiting room. I overheard what's happening. He looked directly at Margaret. I'd like to help if you'll let me. Margaret stared at this stranger. He was younger than her, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing jeans and a faded blue jacket. His face was open and kind, with smile lines around his eyes. I don't understand, Margaret said quietly. The man stepped fully into the room. My name is David Torres. I'm here with my daughter. She has physical therapy every Wednesday morning. I've been bringing her here for about 6 months now. Mr. Phillips held up his hand. Mr. Torres, I appreciate the gesture, but we can't just release a patient to a complete stranger. I know it sounds odd, David said quickly. But hear me out. My daughter Riley is 8. When I got divorced 3 years ago, I didn't know how I was going to manage being a single parent, but people helped me. Neighbors, teachers, even strangers sometimes. He looked at Margaret again. Riley's physical therapist had to cancel today, so we were just sitting in the waiting room. Riley heard the lady at the desk talking about someone who needed help getting home from surgery, but didn't have anyone. And you know what my daughter said to me? No one answered. They were all listening now. She said, Dad, remember when Grandma had her surgery and you said everyone needs somebody? And she was right. My mom lives in Arizona now, but when she had her hip replacement last year, I flew out there to take care of her. Because that's what you do. You show up for people. The room was quiet. Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes. You don't even know me, she finally said. No, David agreed. But I know what it's like to need help. And I know that if my mom was in your situation, I'd hope someone would step up for her. Mr. Phillips cleared his throat. Mr. Torres, this is very kind, but the policy requires the emergency contact to stay with the patient for 24 hours. That's a significant commitment. I understand. I work from home doing website design. I can manage my schedule. I'm happy to drive Mrs. Chen home, make sure she's settled, and check on her through the night. Margaret shook her head. I can't ask you to do that. You have your daughter to take care of. Riley will be with me. To be honest, this might be good for her. She's been having a rough time since the divorce. Her mom moved to California for work, so it's just us now. Riley's been feeling pretty alone herself lately. Maybe helping someone else would remind her that there are still good people in the world. There was something in his voice that made Margaret believe him, a tiredness that came from carrying heavy things for too long. Mr. Phillips looked between them, then at the woman from registration. She shrugged slightly. This is highly unusual, he said. But technically, if you're willing to list him as your emergency contact, Mrs. Chen, and if Mr. Torres provides his identification and contact information, we can proceed. Why would you do this? Margaret asked David. Really? Why would you give up your whole day and night for a stranger? David smiled, a sad kind of smile. Because 6 months ago, my daughter fell on the playground and broke her leg in 2 places. We rushed to this hospital and I was terrified. I'm not good with medical stuff. Makes me queasy. But there was this nurse, Nancy, who sat with Riley during every procedure. She held her hand, talked to her about her favorite books, stayed past the end of her shift to make sure Riley was okay. He paused. Nancy told me something I won't forget. She said, "We're all just walking each other home." I didn't really understand it then, but I do now. We're all trying to get through this life, and sometimes we need someone to walk beside us for a while. Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away. I don't even know what to say. Say yes, David said simply. Let me help you. Margaret looked at Mr. Phillips, who was already pulling out forms. The woman from registration was smiling. Okay, Margaret whispered. Yes, thank you. The next 20 minutes were a blur of paperwork. David provided his driver's license, phone number, and address. He signed forms promising to be responsible for Margaret's care. Mr. Phillips went over all the instructions twice, making sure David understood about the medications, the warning signs to watch for, what to do in an emergency. Through it all, Margaret kept expecting to wake up. This couldn't be real. Strangers didn't do things like this. But David was patient through all of it, asking questions, taking notes on his phone. He seemed genuinely committed to this crazy thing he'd volunteered for. Finally, the nurse came to take Margaret back to prep for surgery. I'll be right here when you wake up, David promised. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She followed the nurse down a long hallway, into a pre-op area where she changed into a hospital gown and got settled on a bed. The anesthesiologist came by, then the surgeon. Everyone was kind and professional, but Margaret's mind kept drifting back to the man in the waiting room. David, a complete stranger who had decided to spend his day taking care of her. Any last questions before we take you in? The nurse asked. The man who's waiting for me, Margaret said. David Torres. Could you check on him? Make sure he's still there? The nurse smiled. Honey, he's not going anywhere. I saw him in the waiting room. He's got his laptop out and his little girl is doing homework next to him. They're settled in. Something in Margaret's chest loosened just slightly. The surgery itself was a blur. One moment she was counting backward from 10, and the next she was blinking awake in recovery, her throat dry and her stomach queasy. Welcome back, Mrs. Chen, a different nurse said. Your surgery went perfectly. How are you feeling? Tired, Margaret croaked. Thirsty. That's normal. Let me get you some ice chips. The nurse bustled around, checking monitors and IV lines. Your ride is still here waiting for you. Very nice man. His daughter is adorable. She's been reading books and asking me questions about what different machines do. Margaret managed a small smile. Over the next hour, she drifted in and out of sleep. When she was finally alert enough, they moved her to a different room. And true to his word, David was there. Hey, he said gently. How are you feeling? Behind him stood a little girl with dark braids and big curious eyes. She was holding a stuffed rabbit. This is my daughter, Riley. Hi, Riley said shyly. Are you okay? Margaret felt tears threatening again. She couldn't remember the last time a child had asked if she was okay. I think so, she managed. Riley wanted to give you something, David said. The little girl stepped forward and held out the stuffed rabbit. This is Mr. Hops. He always makes me feel better when I'm hurt. You can borrow him until you're all better. Margaret took the worn stuffed animal, feeling its soft fur. She could tell it was well loved, probably Riley's favorite. Are you sure? Margaret asked. Riley nodded seriously. My dad says when someone is scared and alone, we should share what we have, even if it's our favorite things. David looked slightly embarrassed. We've been working on empathy. It's working, Margaret said, holding the rabbit close. Thank you, Riley. I'll take very good care of Mr. Hops. Over the next few hours, the nurses monitored Margaret's recovery. David sat in the chair by the window, working on his laptop while Riley colored in a coloring book. They were just there, present, not making a big deal of it. When the doctor finally cleared Margaret for discharge, David helped pack up her things. The nurse went over all the instructions again, giving David a thick packet of information. You've got my number, the nurse told Margaret. Call if anything doesn't feel right. And you're lucky to have such a devoted son. Oh, he's not, Margaret started, but David just smiled and said, I'll make sure she calls if there are any problems. In the parking lot, David's car was a slightly dented SUV with a car seat in the back and juice boxes in the cup holders. Very much a dad's car. He helped Margaret into the front seat with careful hands, making sure she was comfortable before closing the door. Riley climbed into her car seat without being asked, buckling herself in. Where do you live? David asked, starting the engine. Margaret gave him her address. It was only 15 minutes from the hospital, in a quiet neighborhood of older apartment buildings. As they drove, Riley chatted from the back seat about her day, about the physical therapy she'd missed, about how she'd seen a therapy dog in the hospital lobby. Do you like dogs? She asked Margaret. I do, Margaret said. My husband and I had a golden retriever years ago. Her name was Honey. That's a good name for a dog, Riley said approvingly. When they pulled up to Margaret's building, David studied it for a moment. Which floor? Third floor. There's an elevator. Good, let me help you up. And just like that, this stranger and his daughter were walking into her life, into her home, into the quiet space that had been empty for so long. Margaret's apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a retired librarian. Books lined every wall, organized by subject and author. The furniture was old but well kept. Photos covered the mantel above a small fireplace that probably hadn't been used in years. David helped her to the couch, making sure she had pillows behind her back. Riley stood in the middle of the living room, turning slowly to take everything in. You have so many books, she said in an awed whisper. I do, Margaret agreed, settling carefully into the cushions. I worked in a library for 30 years. I couldn't help collecting them. Riley loves to read, David said, setting Margaret's bag down by the couch. It's the only thing that keeps her quiet for more than 5 minutes. Do you have any books about horses? Riley asked hopefully. Despite the discomfort and the strangeness of the situation, Margaret found herself smiling. Third shelf from the bottom, over by the window. There's a whole section. Riley's face lit up. She looked at her father for permission. David nodded, and she hurried over to explore. I need to get a few things organized, David said to Margaret. The nurse gave me your prescription. Is there a pharmacy nearby? There's one 3 blocks down on Maple Street. Okay, I'll run and get that filled. Will you be all right for 20 minutes? Margaret nodded. I think so. Riley, David called. Come here for a second. The little girl came over, already holding a book about a girl who loved horses. I need to run out for a few minutes. I want you to stay here with Mrs. Chen. Can you do that? Be helpful? I can do it, Riley said seriously. She looked at Margaret. Do you need anything? Water? A blanket? I'm okay for now, sweetheart. David grabbed his jacket. I've got my phone. Riley knows how to call me if anything happens. I'll be back as fast as I can. And then he was gone, and Margaret was alone with this 8-year-old child she'd met just hours ago. Riley stood there for a moment, uncertain. Then she said, Would it be okay if I read to you? My dad says reading helps when you don't feel good. That would be lovely, Margaret said. Riley climbed into the armchair across from the couch, tucked her legs under her, and opened the book. She began to read, her voice clear and steady. She was a good reader, better than most third graders Margaret remembered from her library days. As Riley read about a girl training a wild Mustang, Margaret closed her eyes and listened. The pain medication was making her drowsy, but she fought to stay awake. There was something surreal about this moment. This morning she'd been alone and terrified. Now there was a child in her living room, reading to her like it was the most natural thing in the world. When David returned 20 minutes later, he found them exactly like that. Riley reading, Margaret listening with her eyes closed. "Everything okay?" he asked quietly. Margaret opened her eyes. "Perfect." David had brought more than just the prescription. He held 2 grocery bags. "I hope you don't mind," he said, a little sheepish. "I grabbed a few things. The nurse said you should eat light for the next day or 2. Soup, crackers, that kind of thing. I wasn't sure what you had." He unpacked chicken broth, saltines, ginger ale, applesauce. Simple things, but thoughtful ones. "You didn't have to do that," Margaret said. "I know. But I was already there." He set the medications on the coffee table. "The pharmacist went over everything with me. You need to take one of these every 6 hours for pain, and this antibiotic twice a day with food." He pulled out his phone and set alarms. "I programmed these so we don't forget. First dose of pain medication is in 3 hours. Margaret watched him move around her small kitchen, putting things away like he'd been there 100 times. Riley had gone back to her book, completely absorbed. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. David came back into the living room. "Of course. Why are you really doing this? And don't say it's because someone helped your mother. There's more to it than that." David sat down on the edge of the armchair where Riley was reading. He was quiet for a moment, and Riley reached over to pat his hand without looking up from her book. "When my wife left," he finally said, "she told me I was too soft, too willing to help other people. She said I needed to focus on my own life, my own success, that I wasted too much time on things that didn't benefit us." He looked at his daughter. "But Riley and I, we think differently. We think helping people is never a waste of time." "Your ex-wife is wrong," Margaret said firmly. "The world needs more soft people." David smiled. "Riley says the same thing. She told her mother that being kind is actually being strong. Smart kid. She has her moments." The afternoon passed quietly. David made soup for an early dinner, heating the broth and adding some crackers on the side. Margaret managed to eat a little, though her stomach was still unsettled from the anesthesia. Riley entertained herself with the books, occasionally reading passages out loud that she found particularly interesting. She treated Margaret's collection with careful respect, turning pages gently and putting each book back exactly where she found it. As evening fell, David helped Margaret to her bedroom so she could change into more comfortable clothes. He waited outside the door, calling out, "You okay?" "Every few minutes, I'm fine," Margaret called back, though getting into her pajamas was harder than she'd expected. Everything pulled at the incisions. When she emerged, David had transformed her living room. He'd found extra blankets in the linen closet and made up the couch for himself. Riley's backpack was set up as a makeshift bed on the armchair with a sleeping bag he'd apparently brought from the car. "You can't sleep like that," Margaret protested. "You'll be miserable." "I've slept in worse places," David assured her. "This is luxury compared to the hospital waiting room chairs I've dozed in over the past 6 months." "There's a guest room," Margaret said. "It's small, but there's a bed, please." David hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Riley can sleep in there too. It's not right for you both to be uncomfortable after everything you've done." David finally agreed. He got Riley set up in the guest room, and Margaret showed him where the extra towels were, where the bathroom light switch was, all the little things a guest needs to know. "The pain medication is going to make you groggy," David reminded her. "The nurse said you might feel confused or disoriented when you wake up at night. That's normal, but it's also why you shouldn't be alone. If you need anything at all, you call out." "I'm a light sleeper." Margaret nodded, suddenly exhausted. The day had been too long, too full of emotions she didn't know how to process. She settled into her own bed, in her own room, but for the first time in 5 years, she didn't feel completely alone in the apartment. There were people in the next room, people who cared even if they were strangers. She drifted off quickly, the pain medication pulling her down into sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, Margaret woke up confused. For a moment she didn't remember the surgery, didn't remember why she was hurting. She tried to sit up too quickly and gasped at the sharp pain. The room spun. She felt nauseous. She needed to get to the bathroom, but when she swung her legs out of bed, the floor seemed to tilt beneath her feet. She must have made some noise, because within seconds there was a soft knock on her door. "Mrs. Chen, you okay?" David's voice, gentle but alert. "I need..." "The bathroom," Margaret managed. "But I'm dizzy." The door opened just enough for David to slip in, keeping it mostly closed to give her privacy. "Let me help you." He was at her side in an instant, one steady hand on her elbow. "Take it slow. The nurse said this might happen. It's the anesthesia still in your system." He guided her to the bathroom, waited outside while she was inside, then helped her back to bed. He brought her water and helped her sit up against the pillows to sip it. "Thank you," Margaret whispered. Her voice was shaky. "I'm sorry, don't be sorry. This is exactly why you needed someone here." He pulled the blanket up around her. "Think you can sleep more?" Margaret nodded, though tears were sliding down her cheeks. She was crying and wasn't even sure why. Everything felt overwhelming. The pain, the kindness, the strangeness of having someone care for her. "Hey," David said softly. "It's okay. You're okay. I've got you." And somehow those simple words broke something open in Margaret's chest. She hadn't heard words like that in 5 years. Not since Robert died. "I'm sorry," she said again, wiping at her tears. "I don't usually fall apart like this. You just had surgery. You're alone. You're in pain. I think falling apart a little is pretty reasonable." David sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance but staying close enough to be comforting. "My mom did the same thing when I took care of her after her hip replacement. Cried at everything. The nurse said it's partly the medication, partly the stress. It's okay to not be strong all the time." Margaret took a shaky breath. "I'm just not used to anyone taking care of me anymore." "Well, for the next 24 hours, you don't have a choice. Riley and I are officially in charge." Despite everything, Margaret laughed. It hurt her incisions, but she laughed. David smiled. "That's better. Now you need to sleep. I'm right next door. You call out if you need anything. And I mean anything. I don't care if it's 4 in the morning. Deal?" "Deal." He stood up, moving toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. "Mrs. Chen, I know this is all really strange, having strangers in your home, but I hope you know we're not going to let you down." "I know," Margaret said. And somehow, impossibly, she did know. After David left, closing the door softly behind him, Margaret lay in the darkness of her room and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. She wasn't alone in her apartment. Wasn't alone with her pain and her fear. There were people here who cared, who were watching over her. Strangers who had become something more in the span of a single day. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself sink back into sleep, trusting that if she needed help, someone would be there. It was a strange kind of gift, this trust in people she barely knew. But as she drifted off, she found herself grateful for it. Grateful for David's kindness. Grateful for Riley's sweet spirit. Grateful that in her moment of greatest need, the universe had sent her exactly what she needed, even if it came in the most unexpected package. Morning came with sunlight streaming through Margaret's bedroom window. She woke slowly, feeling sore but better than she'd felt during the night. The confusion from the anesthesia had cleared and her mind felt sharper. She could hear voices from the kitchen, David's deeper tone and Riley's higher musical one. The smell of toast drifted down the hallway. Margaret managed to get herself to the bathroom and back without help this time, though everything still hurt. When she made her way to the kitchen, moving slowly and carefully, she found David making breakfast while Riley set the small table. "Good morning," David said, looking up with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Sore but better." "What time is it?" "A little past 8. I was just about to check on you." He gestured to the counter. "I made eggs and toast. Very plain, very boring, but the nurse said that's best for today." Riley came over and very gently hugged Margaret around the waist, being careful to avoid where the incisions were. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen. Did Mr. Hops help you sleep?" Margaret looked down at the little girl and felt her heart squeeze. "He did. He's very comforting." They ate breakfast together at Margaret's small kitchen table. It was strange having people in her space, but it was also nice. The apartment felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. Riley talked about school, about her friends, about how she was behind in math but doing great in reading. David listened with the patient attention of a parent who'd heard these stories before but never grew tired of them. "Do you have kids?" Riley asked Margaret suddenly. The question hung in the air for a moment. David shot his daughter a look. "Riley, that's personal." "It's okay," Margaret said quietly. "No, I don't have children. My husband and I couldn't have them." "That must have been sad," Riley said with the blunt honesty of children. "Sometimes it was," Margaret admitted. "But your father is right. We make families in different ways. After breakfast, David insisted on cleaning up while Margaret rested on the couch. He brought her medication right on schedule, just like he'd promised. Riley curled up in the armchair with another book from Margaret's collection. "I should let you get back to your regular life," Margaret said as David settled on the other end of the couch with his laptop. "You've done more than enough." "The nurse said 24 hours, David reminded her. "We've got about 12 more to go. Besides, I told you I work from home. I can do my work from here just as easily." "What about Riley? Doesn't she have school?" "It's Wednesday. She only has half day on Wednesdays this semester. And honestly, I think this is more valuable than what she'd learn in class today." "Learning to help people?" Margaret asked. "Learning that helping people matters," David corrected. "That it's not just something you talk about. It's something you do." Over the next few hours, a comfortable routine developed. David worked on his laptop, occasionally taking phone calls about website designs. Riley read, sometimes aloud, sometimes to herself. Margaret dozed on and off, still recovering. Around noon, there was a knock on the door. David went to answer it and came back with a concerned look. "It's your neighbor from upstairs, Mrs. Patterson." Margaret sat up straighter. "Oh no, is she okay?" Mrs. Patterson shuffled into the living room, leaning on her cane. She was a tiny woman with white hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Margaret Chen, why didn't you tell me you were having surgery?" she demanded. "I saw you leaving yesterday morning looking nervous as a cat, and now there's strangers in your apartment." "They're not strangers exactly," Margaret started. Mrs. Patterson looked David and Riley up and down. "You're not family." "No, ma'am," David said politely. "But I'm helping Mrs. Chen recover from her surgery." "Where's her family then?" The words hit harder than Mrs. Patterson probably intended. David caught Margaret's expression and stepped in smoothly. "Mrs. Chen's family lives far away. I'm a friend helping out. This is my daughter, Riley." Riley waved shyly from her chair. Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly when she saw the little girl. "Well, I suppose that's all right then. I just wanted to make sure no one was taking advantage." She turned back to Margaret. "Why didn't you ask me to help?" "You have your own health problems," Margaret said gently. "I couldn't ask you to take on more." Still should have told me." Mrs. Patterson looked at David again. "You're treating her right? Making sure she eats? Taking her temperature to watch for fever?" "Yes, ma'am. I have a whole schedule the nurse gave me." "Good." Mrs. Patterson nodded. "I'll check in tomorrow. Margaret, you call me if you need anything. Anything at all." She pointed her cane at David. "And you make sure she does." After Mrs. Patterson left, David let out a breath. "She's protective of you. She's been here longer than anyone. Watched me and Robert move in 30 years ago. She can be gruff, but she has a good heart." "Like someone else I know," David said, smiling at Margaret. As the afternoon wore on, Riley grew restless. She'd been cooped up for almost 2 days now, first at the hospital and then in Margaret's apartment. "Can we go outside?" she asked her father. "Just for a little while?" David looked torn. "I don't want to leave Mrs. Chen alone." "I'll be fine," Margaret assured him. "I feel much better. And you two need a break. What if you need something?" Margaret picked up her phone from the coffee table. "You gave me your number. I'll call if anything happens. Go. Take Riley to the park or something. You've been cooped up too long." David hesitated but finally agreed. 30 minutes. That's it. And you call if anything feels wrong." After they left, the apartment fell quiet. Margaret sat in the silence, but it felt different than it usually did. It wasn't the heavy, lonely silence she'd grown used to. It felt more like a pause, a breath between conversations. She looked around her living room with fresh eyes. When had it become so much like a museum? Everything in its place, nothing disturbed. A life preserved in amber rather than lived. True to his word, David and Riley returned in exactly 30 minutes. Riley's cheeks were pink from the cold air, and she was chattering about the ducks they'd seen in the pond. "There was this one duck that kept following us," she told Margaret excitedly, like he wanted to be friends. "Maybe he did," Margaret said. "Animals are good judges of character." That evening, David made simple pasta for dinner. They ate together again, and Margaret found herself actually enjoying the food. Her appetite was coming back. After Riley went to bed in the guest room, David and Margaret sat in the living room. The TV was on quietly. "Some nature documentary about ocean life. Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Sure." "How are you really doing?" "With everything." The divorce, being a single parent. You've been taking care of me, but who takes care of you? David was quiet for a long moment. Honestly, most days I'm barely holding it together. Riley's mom sends money, but she's not involved. She moved across the country for her career. Sees Riley maybe twice a year, and Riley tries to be brave about it, but I know it hurts her. That must be hard. For both of you. It is. But we manage. We've got each other. He paused. The thing is, before the divorce, I had this idea of what my life should look like. Nice house, successful career, perfect family. When that fell apart, I had to figure out what actually mattered. And what does matter? Margaret asked, showing up. Being present. Doing the right thing even when it's not convenient. He looked at her. Helping a stranger who needs surgery might seem like a small thing, but to Riley, it's huge. She sees that compassion isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. Margaret felt tears threatening again. You're a good father, David. I'm trying to be. That's all any of us can do, right? Just try. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the ocean creatures glide across the TV screen. What about you? David asked. How have you been doing? Really doing these past 5 years alone? Margaret considered the question. No one had asked her that in a long time. Not really asked, expecting an honest answer. Some days are better than others, she finally said. I thought I was okay. I have my routines, my books. But this surgery made me realize how isolated I've become. I didn't have a single person to call. That's not okay? No, David agreed. It's not. But maybe that changes now. What do you mean? He smiled. I mean, Riley and I would like to stay in touch. If that's okay with you, maybe we could visit sometimes. Riley could borrow more books. Margaret's throat tightened. You'd want to do that? Why wouldn't we? You're kind, you're interesting, you have an amazing library, and Riley already adores you. But I'm just some old woman you met at a hospital. You're a person who needed help and who let us help you. Do you know how rare that is? Most people are too proud to accept kindness from strangers. You trusted us. That means something. Margaret thought about that. She had trusted them, had let them into her home, into her life. It had felt risky at the time, but now it felt like the best decision she'd made in years. I'd like that, she said quietly. I'd like it very much if you stayed in touch. Then it settled. David stood up and stretched. Now I'm going to do one more check of your medications and then try to get some sleep. Tomorrow morning I'll help you get settled before we head out. David? He turned back, thank you. For everything. I don't think I can ever really express how much this has meant to me. You don't have to thank me, he said. Just promise you'll call if you need anything. Even after we leave, Riley and I are in this now. You're not alone anymore. After he went to bed, Margaret sat in the quiet living room for a long time. Her phone was on the coffee table, and she picked it up, scrolling through her contacts. So few names, so few connections. But now she had David's number, and Riley's presence in her life, even if just for visits, it wasn't much. But it was more than she'd had 24 hours ago, more than she'd had in 5 years. She thought about what David had said. About showing up, about doing the right thing, about how compassion wasn't just talk but action. Tomorrow, David and Riley would go home. Margaret would be on her own again, but somehow it felt different now. The loneliness had been broken, cracked open by unexpected kindness, and maybe, just maybe, that crack would let in enough light to help her find her way back to living, instead of just existing. Margaret went to bed that night feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. 6 months passed in a way that Margaret never could have predicted. What started as a single act of kindness from strangers had bloomed into something that changed all 3 of their lives. It began small. The day after David and Riley left, Margaret's phone rang. It was Riley, calling to make sure she was okay and to tell her about a book she'd started reading. They talked for 10 minutes, and when they hung up, Margaret realized she was smiling. 3 days later, David stopped by after dropping Riley at school. He brought soup his mother had sent from Arizona, saying she'd heard about Margaret and wanted to help. He stayed for coffee, and they talked about his work, about her recovery, about ordinary things that felt somehow significant.